Okay, hi everybody. Dr. Hume again. It is time to go back to Hills Like White Elephants. So this is Hills Like White Elephants and Beginning of Life and End of Life Issues Part 2. All right, so where we left off, we had established what we do know. Given the text, this actual piece that we have here, what do we actually know about this couple when we analyze closely? And what we were able to discern from that is that this is a story about a couple who is deciding whether or not to have an abortion procedure or pregnancy termination procedure. So the next question I asked you to consider in order to process through, like, what advice would you give Jig? How would you deal with Jig if she was a friend of yours or a potentially a patient? How would you think about Jig? What we need to process through is what are some more things that we might like to know in order to better advise her. So what we're going to do is ask ourselves, what would we like to know? Okay, so here's the big one. We don't really know for sure, and it's not identified anywhere in the text, what exactly the relationship is between Jig and this man. We know that they are together romantically, that they've been intimate. We know they're traveling Spain. What we don't know is that whether or not they're actually married to one another, how long they've been together. Some scholars have, in reading this story and analyzing it, have speculated that they are, one or both of them are cheating on a spouse because of the sort of risque, sort of escapist way in which they're traveling together, sort of frivolously around Europe. But we don't know that for sure. We don't know necessarily the nature of their relationship. It's clear that there's a division between them, though, because he says in the story, hold please, he says, they're talking about whether or not they can have everything, right? She says, we could have everything, and every day we make it more possible. And she says, we could have everything. We can have everything. No, we can't. So, and she says, no, it isn't. Once they take it away, you never get it back, right? And so when she's thinking of everything, she's thinking of a very different idea of everything. We could have everything, and every day we make it more impossible. And she's thinking, of course, of the baby, of having the whole package, right? And there's this debate between them about whether or not they can have everything. And his idea of everything is very different. And then you see down here, they get to, once they take it away, you never get it back. But they haven't taken away, we'll wait and see, right? So they have very different ideas of, quote, what everything is. And he keeps trying to push her that the procedure is normalized, that it's easy and simple. And so we know there's a significant division between them emotionally about this. So there's some division or conflict. So they're not perhaps as emotionally close as we might like. All right, so what else would we like to know? Some people have pointed out in the past that they would like to know more about Jig's health history. Solid point. We just don't have that information, right? And we're not going to get it. There's no speculating we can do. There's no information for us to draw on. What we do know is this. It's the 1920s, right? And she is in between a rock and a hard place. She has two options. One is have a at-home illegal abortion or an abortion performed by a doctor who is doing it illegally, both of which are incredibly dangerous. The odds of dying from a procedure are much higher than the odds of surviving it. And should you survive it, the odds of losing the ability to then have another child are high, right? So incredibly dangerous. Or if she chooses to bear the child, which we are given to understand that he's not interested in, right? She's going to be a single mother. And in the 1920s, life as a single mother, particularly unmarried, is exponentially harder than it is today. And today it's really hard, right? But what I mean is that it would have been considered morally poor judgment. It would have been considered in a lot of circles that having a child would have been a product of making poor choices. You would have been frowned upon and judged, and it would have been thought of that, like, this is your consequence. This is what you get for making bad choices and having sex when you shouldn't. And that would have been used in a lot of sort of moral circles and moral thinking as a way to shrug off single mothers, right? So they would not have been employed. It would have been very hard for them to find jobs. It would have been very hard for them to find support. And remember, this is before we had like resources. The government didn't give food stamps or welfare or any sort of support to women, a significant support, I should say, to women with single mothers with children, particularly those who were unwed with children out of wedlock. They were simply viewed as bastards. Additionally, a child in that circumstance would have been endlessly teased and tortured by peers, would have been judged and frowned upon by other adults, right? A child out of wedlock was seen as almost a curse by a lot of people back then. So the environment that this kid Jig would have grown up destitute. And I did some research on this. I did a lot of research finding out what the life of a single mother would have been like at the time, right? So this is not coming from nowhere. Jig would have been reduced to a pretty terrible, low-paying job that would have subjected her to a lot of abuse. Or she might have ended up as a prostitute if she was on her own. And she would have been raising a child on her own, and that child would then have been subjected to, again, a lot of abuse from the world around it. So Jig's looking at some pretty terrible options here. This is a pretty grim story, is what I'm getting at. There is no world in which this turns out well for Jig. I hate to say it. So those are the things we do know about her potential health choices and the choices that she might be making that have to do with like her future health, right? What else would we like to know about Jig and the man? People have asked, on another note, they have pointed out that it would be nice to know, hello. Be nice to know what kind of a relationship they have. People have noted that it appears toxic because he doesn't care about her needs, and he seems to not care enough about her needs such that he's trying to push his onto her. Here's the big thing a lot of people want to know. What actually happens? What decision does Jig want to make? What's her point of view on this? All right, so on that note, let's go back to the story. It's always back to the text. What is the story telling us? All right, so what is the story telling us? The story's telling us Jig is deeply conflicted about this, right? She is upset. Please, please, please stop talking. I'll scream. And then we get to the end of the story here. He picks up the bags and carries them around the station to the other tracks. The train is coming, and people have asked, what's the relevance of the train? Why is the train important? The train represents time. There's a time constraint here, right? In the same way that a baby comes after 9 months, whether you've made a decision or not, the train is also coming, right? So the train adds the element of time pressure and is a metaphor for the coming of their future, right? So if we think of it that way, we know that Jig is feeling at the very least conflicted. She's smiling, but like, is it a fake smile or is it a real smile? We don't know. We know that he takes the bags around to the other side of the tracks. People have speculated that this movement of the bags from one side of the tracks to the other signifies the fact that she does decide to have an abortion, right? We've literally got him like getting rid of the baggage. And so he comes back and then he says, "Do you feel better?" And she says, "I feel fine. There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine." Well, there's a bunch of different really interesting ways we could read that, to be honest, right? We could read it as like she's saying, "I'm fine. Yeah, I feel good about this decision." That's the easiest one. We could read it as her saying, "I feel fine. There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing wrong with being pregnant. Pregnancy is not a problem, right? I'm fine." And that is more of a conviction that she says, she would like to carry through with the pregnancy. We can also read it as working on two levels. One, she's saying to him, "I feel fine," right? Which, as somebody in the other class said, like it's female doublespeak, right? Like, "No, I'm fine," when in reality you're the opposite of fine, right? So we can read this a bunch of different ways that are kind of conflicted, but we know that she has really mixed emotions and seems resistant to want to do this, and he seems like he wants to do it. So we know that that's kind of her perspective. Whether or not she actually does it, we may never know. We certainly can't dig up Hemingway and ask him, but I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are, like what your read on this whole deal is. Do the bags mean that they decide to terminate the pregnancy and lose the, quote, baggage? Does she really feel fine? Is she fine? That's the question. Is she really fine? All right. So there's all sorts of things that like we want to know about Jig and the man that we're never going to know, right? These would be useful in helping us think a little bit about how to help Jig, how to advise Jig if we knew Jig. The other one that folks have pointed out in the past is this. How does her situation translate to now? They say, "This is an interesting story, Dr. Heumann. It helps us to facilitate this conversation, but it's 100 years old. What would this situation look like now?" And that is a solid point, right? So I'm going to move you into a little more understanding of what the situation, what the background of a situation like this might be now. So we've got 1920s, an American couple in Europe, and as we move through the 20th century, what we see is the American public, via the Supreme Court, starting to make a lot of decisions about how we think about the beginning of life and then how we think about the end of life. And it might seem like those two are opposites, but they're actually totally interrelated under the Constitution. And the Supreme Court decisions that govern them are totally interrelated. In fact, they're all based on one another, like dominoes. One case was decided, and then another case was based on that case, and so on. Those are called precedents, when the Supreme Court makes a decision and then uses that decision as a motivation to make another decision.